The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to BGA's Trailblazer webinar series. With me today, I have Carolyn Cordery, who's a professor of charity accounting and accountability at Aston University here in the UK. Her research focuses on not-for-profit organizations, accounting and accountability, and she's particularly interested in how these organizations are resourced by donors, philanthropists, grants, contracts, and so forth, and the resource constraints that cause many of these organizations to be financially vulnerable. She also maintains a strong interest in the operation and value of public sector audit and is currently completing a Routledge Companion on this topic with Professor David Hay from the University of Auckland. So without much further ado, Carolyn, you can take over.
Thanks a lot for the introduction, and thanks to those who have joined in to the webinar today. So in this presentation, as the slides say on the front here, I'm going to examine the risks and opportunities for supreme audit institutions in the future. What can we see today that will affect how audit will be continued in the public sector, and what the value will it create? So what we're going to do is take an overview of sort of the environment, and forgive me, a lot of this was written before the current environment, but I've brought some of that in as well. But looking at the environment and seeing what the future forecast might be for accounting and auditing profession and for public sector audit. And as per the introduction, it reflects research that Professor David Hay and I have been undertaking, and we're going to publish in a short book in the Routledge Focus on Business series. So we're drawn on here on current literature and the results from a survey of supreme audit institutions to see what they're preparing for and how, and what the implications might be for these institutions in respect of the public audit future. So I know that I've just said I'm going to look at public sector audit, but actually I want to begin by thinking about audit more generally. And these are some of the photos that we've seen over the past year or so, the pressure on private sector auditors. And it's really part of the environment that audit professionals are working in today. So if we can think back a couple of years ago, in May 2018, the Parliamentary Committee on the Collapse of the Construction and UK Outsourcing Company, Carolyn, said recklessness, hubris and greed were allowed to run riot because there was no incentive to blow the whistle. So obviously the committee believed there'd been a failure not just of the model for providing public services that Carolyn had been heavily involved in, but of the audit system itself, because audit is one way in which the businesses that we rely on are kept financially honest. And some of the MP's strongest words were actually reserved for the accountants that should have acted, they thought, as the company's financial watchdogs. So we had, in this particular failure, KPMG had earned £1.5 million for the audit of Carolyn's accounts, and they were accused of misrepresenting the reality of the business. They had expressed no concern over the reported profits of $150 million, but 4 months later, Carolyn's profits were illusory. Some of the revenue in those profits had been for work that wasn't even agreed, let alone for work that hadn't been done. So Carolyn was obviously in the bad books, and we can see here a picture of people who were demonstrating against Carolyn and against auditors. Pretty much one of the first times I've ever seen anyone demonstrating against auditors. And of course, KPMG have taken some action since then. They've suspended the audit partner that was responsible for the audit, and there's an internal investigation ongoing. And the Financial Reporting Council, the FRC, has obviously been watching this very closely. But it's not just KPMG. Ernst Young were head up for signing off the London Capital and Finance accounts. There was poor auditing there. London Capital and Finance had targeted ordinary savers, offered them very high returns, 8% on mini bonds, and it collapsed about a year ago in March 2019. Investors might be lucky if they get 20% of their money back. The administrator said the cash was invested in 12 companies, and most of them were quite close connections to the founder of London Capital and Finance, and the auditors had not highlighted these very close relationships. In the third example I'm just going to give you, you can see the patisserie Valerie picture here on the screen. Don't we all love the cakes and coffee that they've served in the past? And they, as we know, been at the centre of an alleged accounting fraud. Grant Thornton was their auditor there, and the watchdog called the quality of its work unacceptable. And indeed, the FRC has said that half of the 8 of the Grant Thornton audits it inspected for the 2017-18 year required significant improvement, and fined them £422,500 for failures. So I've identified 3 accounting firms here, but across the industry, 1 in 4 audits have failed to reach the standards, and obviously we will continue to see fallout there. Continued calls for regular changes, regular calls for changes to the audit market. And we can see reviews here in the UK with the Brydone call. In Australia, the Senate is requiring a parliamentary joint committee on corporations and financial services to come back and talk about how audit regulation can change. We're expecting that in September this year. The Dutch Authority for Financial Markets is exploring vulnerabilities in the structure of the audit sector. We can see discussions in Canada, the list goes on. But the surprising thing to date is that these scandals seem to have passed over public sector audit. And David Hay and I have argued in the past that public sector audit adds value by being independent, high quality, useful. But actually, supreme audit institutions increasingly use these external firms, the accounting firms, to deliver audit services. And we see in the UK that the public sector and local authorities can commission their own audits from private firms. So isn't it likely that changes to the structure and composition of private sector audits will impact public sector audit as well? We think so, and let's look then to what we think is happening in public sector audit. I'm going to look at 4 different types of pressures that might occur in 3 different parts of the audit picture. So you can see here, we think that we've got the global environment, and then underneath government and public policy, the profession and audit itself. So there's a number of different possible futures that we could forecast. There's always going to be a status quo bias. We're always going to think that perhaps what's happened before is going to happen in the future. But I'm going to try and use some of these pressures and trends that we see happening at the moment and see if we can come up with some ideas for the future. So in the global environment, there's a number of studies out there saying how the future is going to be affected by different trends, and we've chosen 4 here: technology, demography, globalization, and scarce resources. Of course, it's no surprise that technology is a major trend. Change is obviously going to affect the future. We see the suggestion that there's going to be exponential growth in information technology, which will lead to increasingly capable machines, increasingly pervasive devices, and increasingly connected humans. That's what Susskind and Susskind tell us. And so artificial intelligence is an example of capable machines. Big data that we talk about a lot in accounting and audit enables new knowledge to be generated more quickly than before. And of course, we're entering an age of global connectivity. So the European Commission readily discusses how we use the Internet of Things. So we'd be thinking that we'd have increased transparency and theoretically more data that's readily available for those who seek to analyse it. Demography. We can see that we've got a rising population, longer life expectancy, changing reproductive patterns, and greater proportion of the world is going to be living in Asia in the future. All of these will disrupt our notions of population growth. There's also predicted to be more countries reaching the middle income levels at which saving for the future is feasible. So we're likely to see increased international investment, which will require more regulation and careful management. But even though we see people living longer, it's likely that they will have more unequal access to wealth, more complex family structures, greater diversity. And if we have an aging population where we've got weaker family ties and greater inequality, as we see at the moment, it increases the pressure on public spending. And citizens are demanding more personalised services. So we think that demography, the changes in demography, are really going to stretch the world's resources and increase the need for cooperation, especially at government level. So what about those world's resources? Well, this picture here is suggesting climate change, and it's not the only resource that's stretched, but of course, there's a lot of interest in future developments that we should have environmentally friendly developments, that we should curb excesses in consumerism, and that governments should start measuring not just GDP, but some sort of happiness or well-being. All of these demands are going to see how we manage our scarce resources in the future. Now, globalisation, our fourth one, is not a new trend, of course, but what we're seeing now are more unpredictable political developments. And it means that the global factor is going to have a greater influence on politics, but also the way we experience globalisation could be quite different in different regions. Again, an area that we need to see greater cooperation, greater interconnectedness. And I guess also an area where we will see greater technology, so we can either be slightly facetious and talk about presidents who tweet, or we can think about systems like e-voting, especially in these days when some of us are stuck in our houses. So all of these things intermingle. We're going to talk briefly about them across the other areas that I was talking about. So public policy, the profession, and public sector audit. So the Mowat Centre, writing a few years ago, said that governments need to be more proactive in engaging citizens. They need to promote behavioural change, and this will help us mitigate the worst impacts of the changes in the global environment. But the National Intelligence Council in the US was questioning whether governments are able to adapt sufficiently quickly to harness the change that technology can bring. And if they can't adapt sufficiently quickly, then it will be a game changer. So technological change, not only e-government that gives us greater transparency, but also the fact that citizens will be looking for more evidence-based policy and evidence that they can trust. We all know that there's a lot of data out there on the internet, and we have a new breed of influencers who are quite ready to critique government actions. But there's this blurring, isn't there, between the private and the public spheres. There's an increasing issue of cybersecurity. We could have loss of confidential data, defrauding of citizens. And so governments need to be able to regulate and manage the desire to be transparent against the threat of hacking, and these are challenges for the future. The demographic changes that we see, certainly from a public policy point of view, have brought the need for co-production, and I'm using the term co-production of public services to citizens as a sort of a more an overarching term, when professionals and communities both co-plan and co-deliver public services. We often associate that with new public governance, and it is seen often as a way to re-enfranchise citizens after the excesses of new public management. But it certainly recognises the rise of the individual, and it's a way that governments are going to be proactively engaging with citizens to develop a better future. I've split out the resources here from the public policy point of view into two areas: climate change and public debt. There's no question that governments need to adapt systems to reduce the impact of climate change and unpredictable weather events, and that there's a need to build resilience. So the people, citizens, are looking for good policies to manage resources, water, energy, food, minerals, and of course we now have the Sustainable Development Goals with a particular interest in environmental sustainability. And so citizens are looking at how governments are actually putting meaningful programs into the Sustainable Development Goals, which many of them have signed up to. But what is actually happening here with the Sustainable Development Goals and government's commitments? Public debt Mowat Centre highlighted the fact that it was expected to operate as a significant constraint on fiscal and policy options through 2030 and beyond. Now, lots of things are going to create problems with public debt, but actually we're right in the middle of a pandemic, which has had a very sizable impact on government budgets and debt. What we need to see, the IMF Fiscal Affairs in the last 2 or 3 weeks has put out a little white paper, and they say there needs to be more transparent and fair policy measures and risk mitigation. Of course, the pandemic's had a severe impact on our resources, and it may result in a larger public sector in the future if more activities are taken over. Globalisation increasing, as I've already said. What we do in industrialised countries may impact emerging economies, and that's also going to have a pressure in government. I'll talk quickly about the auditing and accounting profession. Susskind and Susskind have written a book about professionals in the future, and they say we're entering a post-professional society. What professions are used to claiming is theirs, technology is breaking down. Anyone can perhaps try to be an accountant or an auditor just through the use of technology. New relationships, new ways of communicating, business fragmentation, more individuals. So we expect to see this happening, more commoditisation of professional work. Should be new roles for non-professionals and for those savvy professionals who find ways to use technology to their own ends and to be able to increase trust in the profession rather than reduction in trust, which is what technology threatens. So we see in the workplace that there's greater networking and collaboration of providers through technology, which can reduce the domination by a prior elite. We also see, of course, in auditing that financial statement auditing can be really helped with technology. Instead of sampling transactions, we can actually use the whole population of transactions and test that. Things like reconciliations and recalculations can obviously easily be undertaken, and artificial intelligence can help us in identifying fraud and other errors. Of course, networking and collaboration, as we're seeing at the moment, technology is helping us to do that, even though we're not in the office and there's alternative arrangements. But how can we control staff, and how can auditors gain visibility over internal controls in this future of people working from home or not working in the office as often as they would? My colleague George Salagini has been doing some research into how auditors have responded to technological changes, in particular big data, and found that they've been quite slow, and other research has found this as well. But audit clients want auditors to look to the future. They want them to perform deeper analysis, to signal risk. And so there's great challenges in how to use big data effectively. Demographic change will affect the profession. I think future employees are going to have different demands, and obviously ability to work from home. Resource scarcity, concerns about climate change will have some effect on financial reporting, and what we see here is the rise of non-financial reporting, and I think there's going to be more of a focus on that. And of course, we can't leave scarce resources without thinking about the going concern assumption, which is definitely being challenged at the moment in a lot of firms that have scarce resources. Globalisation, I've got some notes here for you. It's going to affect the profession, the expansion of readers of audit reports. Perhaps they'll be making demands for more transparent reporting, more frequent reports, other methods of communication. And the calls that we've seen for reform to the audit profession have said that audit needs to be undertaken for a wider range of stakeholders, not just shareholders. Although David Hay, in a recent book on the future of audit, has said that there's going to be more investment in index-based funds. So in fact, we'll have more sophisticated audiences, smaller audiences, rather than larger audiences. So we can take that both ways. Certainly, the expectation gap that we would see through globalisation is also going to be applicable here and applicable to the public sector. Rise of cryptocurrency is going to affect our profession as alternatives to hard currency. And the third globalisation effect will be joint audits, which is often seen as being quite expensive, but we may see some of this in the public sector. So what particular pressures do we see in public sector audit? Well, Pat Barrett, 2 decades ago, so he was the Auditor General in Australia at the time, but he said many Auditors General are taking initiatives aimed at influencing the nature of the corporate governance system rather than simply being a watchdog over it. So Auditors General are not just watchdogs, they're also trying to work for change. And what we've seen, of course, is the rise of performance auditing over that time, greater use of technology and good practice reports, and a much more commercial environment in which supreme audit institutions operate. So all of these things that we've talked about with the other environments are going to affect public sector audit. Much technology is going to be bringing more calls for more transparency. And in the past, there was the idea that crowdsourcing would open public documents to scrutiny, and that there would be a rise of what people called armchair auditors. But we haven't seen that very much. There's a bit of a belief out there, perhaps some skepticism, that the public's not that interested in utilising data to be armchair auditors. But in fact, I think there's a future here for the public auditor of the future to call upon people to analyse particular things and to help them, show them where there are transparencies that they could work on. Now, of course, citizens might be interested in things that don't directly link to the audit, but the public sector auditor should be looking for social media, advanced data analysis, data visualization to tap into that data that's already been analysed and is available. As I've said, changing demographics should lead to greater co-production, which gives citizens demands for more personalised services, and they want to be sure that these services are going to be of good quality. A recent CITFA and public finance publication said that there's going to be a rise of TripAdvisor type metrics as a sort of signalling tool, and we see this, don't we? Whether or not the public health system is working as we should, or whether our local GP has a good rating. All of the privatisation and public sector contracting out that's gone with the new public management reforms have now got our railways telling us whether or not they're turning up on time. TripAdvisor type metrics are increasing. And of course, our privatisation has blurred the lines between what's a public entity, indeed what's part of the public sector, what is an entity, and new ways of auditing and refining the audit mandate to bring in these private sector entities that are now part of the public sector will be required in the future. Performance reporting is also going to need to develop more to assist the better use of scarce resources. We certainly see the public sector being buffeted by greater risks, and there's a question as to whether supreme audit institutions can assist in managing those risks and whether the public sector is actually prepared for them. And so again, I reiterate this, Many people have called for public sector auditors to focus on the quality of governance and to make sure that regulation is working well. And so performance auditors need to start thinking about how can governments be reacting to the future. This may involve them in critiquing policy, which is somewhere that public sector auditors don't like to go. So that's something that we need to think of for the future. In the face of scarce resources, obviously we've got the need for auditors to assist governments in reporting about their environmental sustainability. INTOSAI, so that's the International Organization of Supreme Audit Institutions, has a framework for auditing the achievement of Sustainable Development Goals. And they suggest that this will need more cooperative audits. Sometimes people call those joint audits or coordinated or parallel audits. So more than one auditor working together. And INTOSAI has come up with some regulations or some suggestions, a guide for this, but it is in draft at the moment. And the reason we need to see these audits are to make sure that the Sustainable Development Goals are being met. And we think about these Sustainable Development Goals, actually achieving one goal is going to require work by more than one ministry, more than one department, more than one level of government. And so this is going to be a real challenge for audit of the future. How can we bring about a consolidated audit report, for example, for a poverty reduction program? It is somewhere where we're definitely going to need to be using big data and transparent data. And of course, our scarce resources extend to growing public debt. And we need to have public sector auditors looking at fiscal controls, making sure there's prudent planning, and thinking about the pandemic at the moment. We see resources being offered to private sector operators. We also need to be thinking about the risk of fraud. It may be greater than it has been in the past. We might have people applying, for example, for furloughed employees to pay them, and then find that in fact those employees have been fired and the money is being put into the pocket of the business owner. And so we may see the need of more forensic audits rather than traditional financial statement audits. Often in the past, it's been said that public sector auditors don't have a mandate for corruption or fraud auditing. So that's something that needs to be thought about. Globalization, I'll just quickly talk about that, is likely to increase the uptake of different forms of public administration, and we might think that, okay, we've got good models for public sector audit in the developed world, why can't we just put them across to lesser developed countries? And yet we need to actually bring into thought what is the context in those countries. So I just want to turn to what Supreme Audit institutions are preparing for, having laid the ground for what some of the pressures are. And over the spring and summer last year, David and I surveyed a number of Supreme Audit institutions. The International Organization of Supreme Audit Institutions gave us, or we were able to access their list of members, and we invited the members to answer a survey which we'd provided in English. Now, we had just over 30 responses. I know that's not a huge sample, but of course it was exacerbated by us not translating that into other languages. But all of the respondents that we had agreed that stakeholders made more demands for public sector audits, and that they felt that they were going to predict that they would rise in the future. They thought because of the change in governance structures within government entities, within corporate entities, and the change in technology. So we've got changes in technology and demography. They think there'll be a demand for different types of audits like IT and cybercrime and so on. And in particular, the demands that they saw were likely to be related to future risks. And so the quote I have on the screen here, it's expected that the SAI, so Supreme Audit Institution, based on the analysis of large volumes of information, can not only analyse descriptions, but also projections of the risk or opportunities that could materialise. So we've got more comprehensive analysis of problems. As long as risks increase, stakeholders' demands will increase. And a number of our respondents confirmed that they were developing IT audits, audit of extractive industries, climate change, and so on and so on. So what are they preparing for in terms of the demography focus? And here was a quote from one of the survey answers. We believe that stakeholders will increasingly demand more value for money from public services and more equality in accessing these, more equity in accessing these services. They will be expected to ensure that best use is made of public funds. The traditional issues of transparency and accountability were raised by respondents to our survey, but with a recognition that global expectations of this is increasing. There might be even more need for transparency, that people said. And they believe it's necessary for legislation to reflect the needs for Parliament and other stakeholders to hold the government of the day to account. And that legislation needs to change to respond to future needs. And it's necessary for Supreme Audit institutions also to be prepared for the changes, as you can see from the quote on the screen. What about in terms of resources? Well, resource constraints are obviously going to bring stakeholders who demand more value for money, as I've already suggested, but also looking for new and different assurance products. For example, more performance audit on government programs and projects, on the fulfilment of sustainable development audits. These mirror the call by the Jamaican Auditor General, and she's also the General Secretary for the Caribbean Regional Organisation of INTOSAI, so Pamela Munro Ellis, for Supreme Audit institutions to be determined enough to assist governments to deliver on their sustainable development goals. And in order to do this, public sector auditors are developing and following best practice. Globalisation, as I've suggested, is being picked up in different ways by Supreme Audit institutions around the world. By some, it's in developing specific scope audits and taking up international best practice, as this particular responses show. But there's a suggestion that industrialisations must show the way to emerging economies. And it was noted some SAIs are faced with unique challenges of their geographical location and size. And the IDI, which is the International Development Initiative of the INTOSAI, has greatly contributed to the development of them. But some smaller Supreme Audit institutions and those in countries where conflict has been severe may actually have quite unique challenges to face. And so one of our respondents said in a post-conflict country where systems are being slowly rebuilt, implementation of audit recommendations by public sector entities is a challenge. And I think this reflects the unstable political environment in which we as a world increasingly find ourselves. So it's not just let's take a model from X and put it into Y. We've got unstable political environments, we've got things happening in the world which perhaps we haven't had to deal with before. And dealing with those issues is obviously going to take precedence over planning for other future global trends. Now, although the questions in this part of the survey focused on the future and how it might impact the Supreme Audit institution and its work, some of the respondents actually reflected on different challenges that they were currently having. And they were mainly around independence and competent staff in order to ensure public value. But before I think I'm probably going to be running out of time if I give you too many extra quotes on there. But basically they were thinking more about capacity building of their staff and coming up with good strategic goals so that they want to be acknowledged as a centre of excellence and expertise within their own public sector. So those are the sorts of responses that people were giving us on that part of the survey. So what are the implications for the future? And I've got two slides here where I've given you in the middle column the anticipated change from the literature and then compared to practice, or the sorts of things that we've seen from our discussions and from our survey. And so we do see greater use of technology being predicted and being used, and higher demands for transparency, more transparency, more armchair auditors and so on. But in fact, we don't see these armchair auditors at all. And so we think that, you know, public sector auditors need to start looking for those areas where people have done analysis and to actually be picking those up from different sites, and to be looking at issues that citizens are interested in. And the audit procedures for cryptocurrencies, which is also something that's coming out of technology, are very much still in development. And how are these going to be dealt with? In respect of the changing demographics and we see increased demands for personalised services. For example, in this current pandemic, we saw obviously people wanting to be flown home from different parts of the world. We needed to see an awful lot of co-production happening there with planes and things being brought in. But these obviously stretch the government, and in the public sector audit space, they're going to be stretching the Supreme Audit Institution's resources as they are extending their audits into those co-production areas. The more regulation that we see, more audits we need to see. We did not see in our survey or our other discussions anything about changes in workforce. It seems to be not an issue that's been discussed in public sector audit, and we think this is something that is of some concern. New ways of working were not previously considered, but I'll bet they are being at the moment. So in response, in thinking about the scarce resources and globalization, we see resource constraints driving demands for value for money audits, for performance audits, these requirements to audit national compliance with the Sustainable Development Goals, needing more skills, new skills and non-financial audits, but also a strong Supreme Audit Institution, especially if they're having to critique policy and the rise of joint audits. We have seen discussions about upskilling and greater skills and people wanting to have better skilled staff. And certainly Sustainable Development Goals are an emerging audit area, but it's not clear how these will link to the private sector contributions to the Sustainable Development Goals. And that's something that needs to be discussed more in the future. And fiscal controls are not discussed as publicly as perhaps they could be. And perhaps that's an area that the Supreme Audit Institution can be certainly providing some prodding for. In respect of globalization, we do see the homogenization around international best practice, and INTOSAI has been very active in this space and their regional groupings as well. But there's obviously unanticipated challenges which require new solutions from unstable political environments, and certainly in respect of the pandemic that we're in at the moment. So we also see that stakeholders are getting more and more demanding. Now, arguably less developed countries will learn from developed countries, but instability brings poor infrastructure, and I think we're going to require new methods to be developed. We don't see an awful lot being talked about in terms of new methods of performance audit, but certainly there needs to be more developed there. So if we think about the future of the profession, the public sector audit profession, Susskind and Susskind said that that anticipated changes would, that the future would show a sort of status quo bias, and we'd be able to sort of say, well, you know, anticipated changes should just follow as they were in the past. And certainly the responses to our survey show that bias in a way, but they also show that Supreme Audit Institutions are anticipating and working on assurance services to better meet stakeholders' demands and that they have an eye to the future. But it's quite a near future. So Supreme Audit institutions are constrained by their legal mandate and the slowness with which they can obviously make those public policy changes. But they're also mindful that they have a very important role in enhancing public sector efficiency and effectiveness. So although the future is uncertain, we think it's going to be likely to draw on the trends that we've found through the literature and the surveys, and that while Supreme Audit institutions may not be able to anticipate different reasons for the demand for audit to change, they're certain that stakeholders will demand more audit, and therefore that public sector audit will have value. But they also know that the timeframes for these audits have to reduce from where they are today, and we believe that the scope of public sector audit will also increase. What that means is that we've found that the dominant type of a Supreme Audit institution is a Westminster style audit, which is what we have here in the UK and through many places of the Commonwealth. And generally they undertake fewer audits than other types of Supreme Audit institutions. So we believe that the pressure on audits will mean that these Supreme Audit institutions need to scale up to prepare for the greater demands. I think there will be unexpected changes too. Perhaps the demands for change in the structure of private sector audits that I talked about right at the beginning will have an impact on the public sector, or there might be other reform movements that arise. Would these reforms devalue public sector audit? It would be reassuring to think that there'll still be a lot of value in public sector audit, but even that's not clear. If you get people demonstrating in the street about the audit of Carolyn, will we see that for public sector audit? I hope not, but as governments change to respond to the pressures of the future, Supreme Audit institutions also need to prepare for an uncertain future. And so I think there's need for discussions like this to work out how to respond. So I've repeated my summary here. Thank you for listening to me. Thank you also to the respondents to our survey of Supreme Audit institutions. And I'd be very happy at this point to take any questions that you might have.
Well, thank you so much for that, Carolyn, and a very nice presentation actually on public sector auditing. In fact, let's look into this a bit deeper and look at things such as the harmonization of standards, because I think that was a nice point you brought up. How do you think what efforts would have to take place to harmonize the standards, from nation to nation? Because that would, of course, help a lot in terms of building up the transparency. Do you think there's a need for an institution to do this, or can business schools play a role in supporting this effort? What do you think?
Yeah, good question. And we've analysed actually as part of the book how many countries have IFRS, how many countries have IPSASB, and I'm about to explain those acronyms. But there is a growing trend towards accrual accounting. So I know I'm not talking audit at the moment, but I'll just talk about accounting. So we've obviously got international financial reporting standards put out by the IASB and international public sector auditing standards put out by IPSASB. And a growing number of countries are using that for their public sector accounting. So we're seeing accrual accounting, either going with for-profit standards or with public sector standards. But we obviously have a large number of countries who are still using cash accounting, or maybe using cash accounting for their budgets, if not their financial statements. So there is a big movement to bring people onto accrual accounting, and that would then bring more harmonisation in the accounting that we see. Yeah. And with regards to the auditing standards, there is INTOSAI, the International Organisation of Supreme Audit Institutions, and they're very active in having different levels of auditing standards. And again, we surveyed, as part of our survey, we asked people what types of audit standards they were using, and many of them are using the INTOSAI standards. Some of them are using the International Standards of Auditing that are put out by IFAC. ISAs that private sector auditors use,
Right.
with sort of their own public sector bits on top. So I think we probably see more standardization at the auditing level than we do at the financial accounting level. And so for those of us who are citizens of the world, we might be able to read the audit report and have more understanding of that than actually
Right.
reading financial statements from different countries.
So the
But yes,
accounting yeah. So the accounting statements
yeah,
need a little bit further work here in terms of how numbers are reported.
absolutely. And can business schools help, I think was your question as well. And I
Yeah.
think, you know, we teach our students, we teach them in accounting mostly about IFRS. We teach them about listed companies. I think we need to make the public sector an exciting place for people to want to work, so that they also learn about good public management and how they can help the public sector. So, you know, I know in my teaching and many of my colleagues, we actually bring in some public sector examples. I know there are some universities where public sector standards are also taught in full classes, but certainly exciting the students about the whole range of opportunities they might have as employees to bring their good skills to the public sector would be one way that business schools could very much help.
Very nice. And you know, kind of related to that, and I was thinking about this when you were presenting earlier, was the idea of fraud and corruption and how that basically affects um, you know, the reporting of various standards. Not, you if you take into account, like, you know, politicians, for instance, who are sitting there for a limited term and are looking to work in some project or so forth, that you know, that of course has a lot of meaning to them because that will help them get reelected. How do we avoid that type of corruption? Is there a way to avoid it, or is that something that really has to start from day one in terms of teaching, you know, ethics and responsible management?
Yeah, well, that's a very large question, and I'm sure you know that in because it brings in psychology as well, so it
No,
must be large.
absolutely.
So I'm sure you know that in many countries there are requirements for politicians to report on their spending, and you know, we've had scandals in the UK and in my home country in New Zealand, where politicians have bought personal items more rather
Yeah.
than buying things for citizens. But you know, so that has been in an environment where there's a requirement for increased transparency. In nations where there's issues going on with perhaps corruption, or where politicians are trying to, in effect, bribe citizens to vote for them, that's a slightly more subtle thing. I mean, I think it's something that we have in every country in the world, don't we? We all want
True.
to have something free from our politicians. And sometimes the desires to give us things free might be honourable rather than dishonourable.
Yeah.
So I think it's as I said, the Supreme Audit institutions have not typically seen their role as being to help combat corruption, but there is a move, especially in some African countries, for Supreme Audit institutions to be involved in that. And I think there's more of a call now for people in, you know, in Europe and other developed countries to be considering how a Supreme Audit institution can assist anti-corruption measures and actually have the mandate to do that. Because the question is, who has the mandate? Is it police? Is it, for example, or is it the Supreme Audit institution? So that's a societal question, which then brings us back to the business schools and what can they do. And this is about teaching our students ethics.
Yeah.
And actually thinking about the impact of the choices that we make, and not just making the safe choices. I know when I teach ethics, I often use the American Accounting Association's ethical framework, ethical decision-making framework, and always encourage the students to think about the many options that confront them when there's an ethical issue. I mean, as accountants, we often, research shows that we don't often see the ethical issue. So the first thing is, what's the ethical issue in this scenario? So that gets us thinking about it. We do have an ethical conflict here. And then not just what's the safe option, but what is the whole variety of options, and what are the impact of those options to enable us to negotiate better our way through life is not black and white, so we have to negotiate through quite often quite furry contexts. And so, yeah, I think it is getting students to question, to be skeptical, to realise that they've got an ethical issue, and then to think about the many options that might be open to them to deal with it. And that skills like that are skills that people take through to their life and through to the questions that they might ask politicians, or when they become politicians themselves, to encourage them to act ethically.
Right. And again, related to ethics and responsible management, if we go into the SDGs now, the Sustainable Development Goals, which are published by the UN, is there any collaboration between, the public sector auditing institutions and then of course the UN, in forming let's say a standardized approach to auditing and using the 17 SDGs?
So INTOSAI, I'm sure they've been having lots of conversations with the UN, but INTOSAI has a special working group which is actually headed by the Indian Auditor General, and obviously they have a number of people on that working group, which has been developing measures to help Supreme Audit institutions assess the readiness or the ability of their own government to audit the SDGs. So this is like how ready is the government to actually start working towards the SDGs, and does it have measurement things in place?
Right.
And so that's been something I've been doing over the last 2 years, and India's been doing a lot of work in there, as has Jamaica. So I talked about the Jamaican Auditor General, and so there's quite a lot of activity around that preparedness for reporting on the SDGs. And of course, they've also got a working group that's working on, and that working group will continue on to look at actually auditing the SDGs. The International Development Initiative of INTOSAI has a special school in India, which I'm hoping to do some research on in coming months, to upskill auditors to be looking at these non-financial reporting measures.
Okay.
Such as the SDG. So there is quite a lot of activity. I don't know what the current environment is going to do to that activity, but obviously for the long term, auditors general and their staff are starting to talk about SDGs. As I said, whether this means that there needs to be joint audits with more than one audit institution, so different countries working together.
Right.
There's certainly, what intrigues me is that a lot of private sector companies are saying, they're helping towards the SDGs. In Indonesia, for example, they listed companies actually need to report on how they are complying with a particular or a number of SDGs. So if you've got a large corporate saying, well, we're working towards this SDG, how does the government collect that data from them? How does it inform the government's report on how they've actually achieved that? And I don't know the answer to that, so someone might know the answer. They might want to send me an email, and I realise that I forgot to put my email address on this slide, but hopefully you can find me c.cordery@aston.ac.uk. Send me an email and tell me about activities of how governments are pulling together how Supreme Audit institutions are pulling together that data from the private sector as well as from the public sector. I mean, some of this comes back to the attribution. You know, we bring out if government brings out a new regulation that says you aren't allowed to have plastic bags, and so we have, you know, obviously less plastic around. So we have some good environmental, you know, performance. How much of that environmental performance can we bring to bear on the regulation, and how much of it can we bring to bear on the good work of a company and not making the plastic bags, or in the consumers and not using them in the first place? So you know, attribution is always an issue, but certainly we all want to work towards the achievement of these SDGs.
Of course, absolutely. And you know, it's really interesting because when I, you know, if I research into a company, let's say I'm interested in reading their financial statements and their annual reports to invest in. I mean, more and more companies are reporting, as you say, their efforts in SDGs. And of course, they're all doing it in different ways currently. I mean,
Yeah.
I was looking at SCA, I think yesterday in Sweden, which is it's a forest company that of course produces paper and so forth. And then they of course address some of the SDGs, and they do so very well, but they won't of course address all of them. So that's something also to take into account. You know, if a company say only focuses on some of the SDGs, how does the government then collect that data and compare it, let's say, to other companies? So that's definitely something to think of.
And then auditing it all and having access to that audit, and that, you know, the data that was compiled into the reporting so that you can audit it is a challenge.
Absolutely. Now, and that brings us to the kind of like the last point then is AI, because of course that's becoming more and more more powerful tool now to go through some of, you know, this vast amount of information and data that's all across. How do you see currently from where you're sitting at, do you see any major developments in how AI is being utilized by, you know, not only the public sector, but even the private sector to going through all this in massive amounts of information and figures?
Yeah, well, certainly there's a potential there to use big data much more effectively, and I think there's a lot of talk about it, and there's not a lot of do about it. You know, we are trying to upskill our students to be able to deal with big data, and
Right.
I guess that's as that new generation comes through, and we will see that more. I think in the public sector, the use of big data is obviously very useful for policy making. You know, if you can analyze trends and you can analyze things that are happening. But there is always the issue of confidentiality of the data, and you know what happens if that gets leaked, or
Of course.
someone leaves their laptop on the train. And so anytime we talk about big data, we also need to think about privacy, confidentiality. We need to think about the ability for people to hack, or you know, the cyber security side. So we can't just have big data growing at the risk of not thinking about the security of that data.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's definitely something to keep in mind. Well, I think we're out of time for today, but you know, kind of summarizing that last point you just made, definitely something for entrepreneurial students at business schools to think of if they want to come up with you know, great ways of making money. Maybe they should look into this area of investing into a business or starting up a business that deals with artificial intelligence and auditing as a whole. So we get more of the doing and less of the talking, right?
That's the one. Absolutely.
Okay, well, wonderful. Thank you so much for today, Carolyn. It's been wonderful having you on. And for everyone sitting here listening, thank you so much for coming on board and contributing. Our next Trailblazer webinar is being currently planned, so stay updated by going to our website and looking at any of the upcoming webinars for research that is being promoted by faculty and BGA. So once again, thank you so much for your time, and I hope to see you again very soon. Take care.
Thanks a lot. Okay, bye.